Following the collapse of the Russian Empire and the execution of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, and his wife in the Revolution of 1917, the new Soviet state sought to restore the borders of the old Russian Empire, which it succeeded in doing in the course of the next 30 years. This illustration of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics shows the huge Russia in the center, joined by 14 other SSRs on its southern and western borders, roughly corresponding to the old Russian Empire. Similarly, the achievement of this territorial unification followed a similar pattern as we saw in the Russian imperial case. That is to say, strong central leadership around a powerful individual, most notably Joseph Stalin. Secondly, the creation of a large, standing, powerful Russian army. Here, the Red Army that was responsible both for the defeat of Germany in World War II and of the occupation of Eastern and Central Europe in the post-war period. Thirdly, an economy that was much more centralized under the Soviet Union than it had been under the old empire. A replacement of the landed aristocracy that had formed the economic linchpin of the Moscow-centered empire for a centrally planned Soviet economy. And finally, as in the traditional Russian case, the imposition of control over labor, not the restoration of serfdom, but as these rich peasants or kulaks learned in the late 1920s and 30s, resistance to central authority would lead to arrest, imprisonment, and even death. So the formula of the Soviet Union was similar to that of the Russian Empire, with similar results: large imperial control over extended territory for security reasons. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Russians first experimented with a type of liberal democracy under the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. But this led to the decline of the Russian economy, to the decline of Russian prestige abroad, and many Russians, indeed most Russians, welcomed the return of strong leadership under Vladimir Putin. Putin responded to Russian concerns about security, the growing internal terrorism identified with terrorists from Muslim Chechnya, and a brutal suppression of the Chechens in the Chechen wars. At the same time, Putin was able to restore the Russian economy largely through the exploitation of natural resources, oil and gas, raising the standard of living of most Russian citizens, a welcome change from the disorder of the Yeltsin years. There has been, to be sure, liberal opposition to the reimposition of authoritarian rule, but for most Russians, the cost is worth it, and Vladimir Putin, re-elected in 2012, remains a popular and stable figure. For Putin and the Russians, the expansion of NATO and the suggestion that NATO would also embrace countries on their border like Ukraine and Georgia, which had once been part of the Russian Empire and part of the old Soviet Union, this now poses what the Russians consider a threat to their national security. The response of the Russian government has been to label these border areas the quote-unquote near abroad, an ill-defined term which from the Russian point of view implies greater control and from the point of view of those countries on their periphery, implies a threat to their independence and security, a threat that we will see played out in a closer examination of three members of that near abroad: Ukraine, Georgia, and Kazakhstan.